We continue our sermon series on the Beatitudes, the most popular teaching of Jesus, and at the same time the most misunderstood. If you ask most, it's sad, followers of Jesus what the gist of the Beatitudes is. If you ask yourself that, you may be like, I'm not really sure. If it's the primary teaching of Jesus, it should be that which informs our faith the most about his teaching. So we've been digging into each of the Beatitudes, and I have personally got a blessing. I hope it's been good for you as well. And that word blessing is the one thing that I start with every time with trying to wrap my mind around the gist of it. It's the one word, no-brainer. He repeats it more than any other word. Blessed are you if you do this. 8 times in a row. In fact, there's nowhere else in Jesus' teaching where he repeats one word that emphatically. So the first thing he wants you to know is he wants you to be blessed. He wanted his listeners to know, I've got something for y'all to do. I got something that I want to impact your life with, but you can't if you don't receive this first idea. You can only do it if you're blessed. That is an inner sense, an undoubtedly inner sense of your life being deeper and richer because of your relationship with Jesus. If you have this, Jesus says, if you become blessed by what I'm teaching you, you will be the light of the world. I'm the light of the world while I'm here, while I'm with you, while I'm teaching, while I'm healing, while I'm reaching out. But when I leave, you're going to be the light of the world if you can carry around this blessing that I'm trying to give you. And so we've been digging into, well, how is it that he teaches to receive this blessing, and as accessible as the word blessing is. I mean, that's the easy part of it. Blessed are you. Okay, I want to be blessed. Who wants to be blessed? Me. Then he adds to it the pathway to the blessing, and in each one, it is so counterintuitive. It just, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. I mean, one after another. It's like, what? And this Sunday is no exception. In fact, I kind of get the sense that it's kind of like an inclining set of monkey bars. Like Jesus wants you to go, you get one, okay, you can reach that. Now reach up to the next one, and reach up to the next one. And it's like, if you keep going on all of them, you finally get to the last one, but you can only get to the last one if you've went through all of them. Point being, they're all sort of ascending in nature, and then you finally get to one. And this one is just, blessed are those, this is Matthew 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Yay! Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Okay, so here's what we're going to reflect on. What is up with this? How does this, in essence, how does this inform our faith? Blessed are those who are persecuted, because Jesus seemed to think that it did. But specifically, here's where I'm going. In Scripture and in history, for God's followers, persecution is common. One might even say to be expected. 2, there is a blessing. There is a blessing that the church gets. There is a blessing that comes with persecution. It is historically verifiable, but then there is also a personal blessing, like you get a blessing. This one's harder to objectively verify, but you can subjectively verify it in the lives of people who have experienced persecution. So it's common to be expected. There is a blessing in the life of the church and in the personal life. And then I'm going to reflect on, what do you do if you are persecuted? If you are being persecuted, how do you respond? And then two, which I think is probably the bigger topic for all of us because of the context in which we live, what do you do if you are not persecuted? So, for one, you must know the common nature of persecution is because that which God is up to is at odds with that which the world is up to. This is the picture of Revelation. It is heaven breaking in, wanting to make a new heaven and a new earth, and in that conflict is where you have the tension. Think about two people getting married, and as they become one, there's tension. You've probably heard about that. As heaven and earth marry, there is tension there, and that's the whole book. And it's that conflict that you get persecution out of. So if you're looking to glorify yourself, you do it quite often by gratifying yourself with what is in the world. And that being the case, you're good. The world's fine. You're accepted. Come be a part of us. That's what we're doing too. But if you are looking to glorify Christ through finding contentment in God, that is opposed to what the world is doing, and you will find persecution. Persecution. It is not just in the world currently that you can see it, which we're going to go into, but it's all through Scripture actually. In fact, the very beginning. So you may have never thought about this in regard to this topic, but the first person born of a man, the first person born from a person, persecuted because of righteousness, the second person born of a person. Cain slew Abel because Abel was seen as righteous in the eyes of God, and Cain was not. And so he persecuted him. The very first two people born of people. That's how common it is. As I read this list, you'll be familiar with it. Joseph was persecuted by his brothers. Moses reviled and insulted again and again. Samuel, as a prophet, was rejected. Elijah was despised by a king and a queen of his day, and they consistently sought his life. This is why nobody names their daughter Jezebel. I dare you to do it. Nehemiah was defamed. Stephen was stoned to death, the first Christian martyr. Peter and John cast into prison. James and John the Baptist beheaded because of their faith. Paul saw a long series of bitter and endless persecution in his missionary journeys, one after another. The letters Paul would send to all of his churches would encourage them to, Philippians 1:29, suffer for his sake. 2 Thessalonians 1:4, he would brag on all of the ways they were being persecuted and their afflictions that they were enduring. Peter, too, would write encouraging his churches of Galatia, Cappadocia, and Bithynia to not be surprised at fiery trials. Don't be shocked. They're common among those who follow the Lord. Don't spread apart as if something strange were happening to you. Continue to gather. Continue to assemble yourselves, even as you're getting persecuted. Paul would tell Timothy, the young man that he was mentoring, that all who desire to live a godly life in Jesus Christ will be persecuted. Not some, all. So it may take a bit of an adjustment of your mindset to know that persecution is not just something that has happened, that happens sometimes and that will happen, but the more one follows Jesus, because that path is set at odds with the system of our world, it pushes back. The powers of this world pushes back on it, and you experience that persecution. The Egyptians would persecute the Israelites. You know that story. Rome would persecute Israel because of their religious affiliation. Some of the most memorable Bible lessons you learned as a child were because of persecution due to righteousness. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into a fiery furnace, not because they smelled bad or they murdered somebody. Just because they wouldn't bow down to a gold statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. Because of their righteousness, they were thrown into a fiery furnace. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, not because of, was tearing up his speeding tickets one too many times. He would pray to God. He was known to pray to God 3 times a day. That's it. And he was thrown in the lion's den. It is common. You may just need an adjustment of mindset. It's normative. And in the one who is teaching this lesson, Christ himself, he simply incarnated all of these attitudes that he's teaching us. That's why they're Beatitudes. They're attitudes that should be in our life. Being poor in spirit, being meek, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, showing mercy, all of these Beatitudes, he simply lived them out. And this is what happened to him. He was crucified, persecuted for righteousness' sake. John 15:20, Jesus teaches, a servant is not greater than his or her master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. It's a historical fact that not only is it common and really to be expected, but things happen when Christians are brave enough to stand up under persecution. Things happen. In the first century, there were more persecutions per capita than, that is proportionally speaking, than we've had in any other time. But in fact, I read this letter. I wrote the guy's name down because it had been a while. Ignatius of Antioch. He was a spiritual leader. That is just a follower in the 100s. Okay, so Peter learned from Jesus. Peter taught this guy named Polycarp, which is another name I would think about naming one of your child, Polycarp. Ignatius learned from Polycarp. So Ignatius learned from a guy who learned from Peter, who learned from Jesus. This is one of the early church fathers. This is what you would call a patristic of the first century. Well, he was being sent to Rome, and he has about 5 different letters. And in one of his letters to Ignatius of Antioch's letter to the Romans, he wrote to those who he had heard were coming to rescue him not to. That he wanted to be the bread of heaven as he was ground by the teeth of the beasts. This is in the letter. He said, and if I get to that day, I do not want you to rescue me. I want this to be a witness to those who are watching, that they are not winning by doing what they are doing. On the contrary, he says in his letter, and if perchance that the lions don't want to eat me, like for some reason they like white meat, not dark meat, and they just don't like how tan I am, I'm going to grab them and compel them, anger them to eat me. And in the face of persecution like this, in these first 3 centuries when the martyrs, when the early church fathers were this bold, this is when the church grew at a rate unseen since then. The higher the persecution, the higher the church growth. True story. Persecution is ours. Now, it can come in 2 ways. One, it can come physically, like you just heard about, and I'm going to read you some statistics as it relates to this day. Persecution can come physically, that is, the taking of your life, but it can also come just verbally. This may be the type that you've experienced. Jesus would say, blessed are you. This is right after he says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. There's the kingdom of heaven. The very next verse, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad. They've done it to others. They're going to do it to you. So persecution is not just a physical thing. It can also be a verbal thing. If you've been talked about, if you've ever been talked about because of something you stood for, because of your faith, this is that type of persecution. Okay, persecution as it goes to this day. If you research it, it's not hard to find. One source that I dug up was from the Church of England that says over the past few decades, the average amount of Christians that die because of their faith in a year is about 100,000. 100,000. From 2000 to 2010, just in the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, 90,000 Christians died every year, just in that area. So if you just take this number from 2000 to 2010, an average of 100,000 per year, that's 1 million. 1 million in a decade. Now, what really stands out to me is not so much the large numbers. You can kind of lose the gravity of it when it gets that big. But when you break it down to the smaller increments, that's what really gets me. If it is in fact 100,000, and that's the low estimate, says the Church of England. The truth is, there's not people recording. How many was that today, Bob? 5. Okay, 5. What were their names? No one's recording the martyrs dying. Okay, it's just happening. More like digging up their graves and counting. So the number is probably much more. This is the low estimate. But if it's just 100,000 a year, even in our day, that means it's about 290 a day, every day. That means, as the number gets smaller, it's just eerie. That means it's about 12 per hour. 12 every hour. That means it's about 1 every 5 minutes. Today. That means if this sermon goes 30 minutes, which it probably will, that means 6. Just as we sit here freely, no concern over being persecuted physically for righteousness' sake, 6 lose their lives. It's heavy. There are not only physical forms, there are verbal forms. And this may be the thing that you experience. I would say especially among our young people. Some of us, the older we get, it's like, whatever, say what you want. Especially when you're real old. You don't care what people think. Yeah, shut up! You say whatever you want, and I can't wait to get there. It's our young people. If you stand up for your faith, right, to get in certain groups, everyone's had to go through this. To get in certain groups in high school or in college, you will be faced with compromising some of your heart's deeper convictions about what is right and wrong. If you become more sexually experimental, sure, come on in this group. That's the way we like you. If you get more experimental with drugs or alcohol, yes, come on in this group. That's the way we like. We are into self-glorification through being gratified by the world's means. Yes, come on in. If you're into talking about other people in a negative way, yes, we want you to glorify yourself, and you do that by talking. You make them less so that you can be bigger. Yes, come on in our circle. If you just talk about life as sucky in general, yes, that's the way we want you. If you embody your living in a way that is glorifying of yourself, gratifying with the world's means, rather than glorifying Christ by being content in God, then you will be let in these groups. But if you don't, if you stand up, if you follow your heart's convictions about what you sense is true between you and God, you will be persecuted. You will be talked about. I would invite you to find people that you can find strength with and stand. You will never regret standing for the Lord. I know I personally have regretted, and I know many people, and they will tell you this, young people, the more they compromise their heart's convictions and went along with these other groups, they regretted stuff. But the more we stood for the Lord and stood by our convictions, the less our regrets were about our life. So find people that will take you by the arm, lock hearts with you, and walk on a path where you will have less regrets in the future. Know that whether it's physical persecution or verbal persecution, there are blessings. Not the easiest thing to hear, but it's true. This is from the Lord. If you follow Jesus, it's very clear. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Well, what does that look like? What does it look like to be blessed for being persecuted? We'll go by the church first. So, fellow by the name of Ajith Fernando, he's a Christian from Sri Lanka. He was visiting a church in Chicago. I know because I listened to a pastor that preaches there. And he was a student there, and he went back home, and he wrote back, and he said that the British Raj were in power, and while they were in power, there was a kind view towards the church. The bishops were all in and out of places of power, and there was almost zero persecution. None. The church had a comfortable life. However, at some point, a militant Hindu government stepped into power. Persecution began. Lives were lost. Many Christians were thrown in jail. But here's the deal, the guy wrote. When we had a comfortable place in power and there was no persecution, there were also very, very few conversions. The church was not growing. When the Hindu government took power and persecution took off, there was a flood of conversions. And the conversions to Christianity outpaced the deaths of the persecution. The blessing to the church is that it's kind of like a storm comes through our town and the weaker limbs of the tree sort of fall out. Stronger bonds between Christians form. Because when persecution hits the church, those who are just like nominally following, those who follow Jesus only by name and not by the embodiment of their life, they flee when persecution comes. And those who are left are strong Christians. And because the church gains strength, it gains a witness that is much more stark to the world in contrast than what it had before. What it had before was a very comfortable way of living. Well, that's the way the world lives. What it has in persecution stands out. You may even say it is a light to the world once it gets under persecution. And because of that, when the light is shining from the church, it grows. One church theologian said, the blessing of persecution growing the church is a lot like the blessing that Thomas got when he was confronted by Jesus for doubting. Thomas said, I've got to see, I've got to feel, I've got to sense something going on here. And this theologian says the world is doing the same thing. As it looks on the church, it's saying, you want me to believe? I've got to see something. I've got to notice something. You've got to look a little different than the rest of the world. Glorify Christ instead of yourself. So, stronger bonds, prayer begins to be stronger. The church is purified. The church is strengthened. The church grows. And an unbelieving world begins to believe a little more. There is a blessing for the church. There's a blessing personally in persecution. Hard to receive. Number one, there's a light that comes out of you. There's a light that's in you. And if you're comfortable in your relationship with Jesus, you know, it's kind of under a bush. You're not really shining. There's no stark difference. You stand up during persecution, just like the church shined, you're shining. You've heard of so many great works have come out of persecution. Great works that continue to bless us to this day. You've heard of the Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. John Bunyan was imprisoned, and he wrote imprisoned 12 years for preaching in England, that it was in jail, he said, that I have never had the word of God so open to me as before. This was after preaching for 9 years. He would write a whole letter about the experience he had knowing God preaching, the experience he had knowing God in just a few months in jail. 9 years preaching, a few months in jail. And he would say the way I got to know God in just a few months in jail eclipsed the way I got to know God in 9 months of preaching. So while he was in jail, he would write A Pilgrim's Progress. This great masterpiece that has inspired many, has been a light to many in regard to their walk with Jesus. And if you read it, it's heavy. I mean, there's persecution involved, and there's a hard walk involved, but there's also growth, and there's also getting to know God on a very personal level. And because of that, one's inner sense of joy, peace, contentment grows. So there's a blessing in your life if you stand under persecution, that you shine a light. Maybe you've said to yourself, what is the purpose to my life? I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I see so many other people shining. They're living their life. I don't know what to do. Question, maybe you're not standing up under certain persecution. Maybe you're not shining the light that God has called you to shine. Maybe there's a light inside of you that God has nudged you to shine, but you've been like, if I shine that, then that's going to happen. Well, then there's your answer. That's why you're not shining like other people that you're seeing. There's a light inside of you, and the blessing, if you stand up under persecution, is that the light comes out. The other thing is, light comes out of you, but the light comes out of you mainly because, Paul Bunyan would say, because of the fellowship he had with Jesus while in jail. John Bunyan, excuse me. He got Pilgrim's Progress because of how he came to know the Lord personally in his time. You have fellowship with Jesus as you stand up under persecution. It's the same thing that came out of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As they stood up under persecution, and they were literally thrown into the fiery furnace, not only was the world seeing a difference, are they still alive? Yeah. Shouldn't they be? Yeah, they should be. But the king looked in and said, and I think there's another person in there. I don't think there's just three. There looks to be like a fourth, and it looks to be like the Son of Man. So as Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were in the fiery furnace, so was the Lord. Can you imagine that moment? Under the most tempered season of persecution, the Lord himself is walking with you through it. You are coming to personally know the Lord in a deeper way than you ever had. So 1, your light shines. 2, you get a fellowship with Jesus that you had not had before. And 3, Jesus teaches here in the Beatitudes that there is an eternal blessing. Rejoice, he says, verse 12, because great is your reward in heaven. His point is very simple. There is a return on your investment. Yes, it's an investment. Yes, you're being called to sacrifice something. It's an investment. But there is a return on that investment that you just have no clue about. Jesus would teach this in several different areas. Matthew 10:42, if you give someone a cold cup of water, you will not lose a reward. Matthew 6:20, lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. The idea there is simple. The more you invest down here, the less you invest up there. Simple as that. The less you invest up here, the more you invest up there. And your investment up here, you cannot compare the investment you make up here to the investment down there. Lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. Simple point. Great is your reward in heaven. It is ours to have. When I was in the Navy, my first year, I was approached by some guys from a bank, and they said, listen, if you start investing this amount, it was like maybe a little over 10, about 11% of my paycheck. If you start investing this amount with us right now, by the time you're 50, you can retire and you will be a multimillionaire. Well, at the time, it was like whatever. I mean, I wanted to spend that money. I wanted to drink that money, right? And so investing that money just did not make sense to me. Well, guess what? In a year and a half, this dummy is going to be 50. And I sure wish I would have made those investments, but I did not, because they seemed ridiculous to me at the time. And in the same way, persecution may seem like an investment that is just ridiculous to you. But what Jesus is saying, just like the bankers were saying to me at a young age, you have no idea what will be here if you stand up to that now. You're not going to regret it. So there are blessings to the church and there are blessings to individuals. What do you do if you are persecuted? What do you do if your preacher preaches too long and it's time to go and it looks like he's just getting warmed up? Do you stand up under that persecution? your Sunday school's texting you. What are y'all doing in there? Okay, real quick. I'll burn through these. If you are persecuted, know that Jesus taught there are some persecutions that you don't have to stay under. So if they persecute you in this city, flee to another city. That is from the mouth of the Lord. You do not have to stand up under every sort of persecution. So if the place you're working in or the school you are going to is too dark or too hostile, if my children were in certain schools today learning some of the things that children are learning now, I would not leave them in those. I would first attempt to get that crap out of the school, and if I couldn't get it out of the school, I'd take my kids out of the school. So that's a type of persecution I think you can avoid. You don't have to stand up under certain persecution. Same thing with you in your work. David would flee sometimes he would stand. Moses would flee sometimes he would stand. Jeremiah would flee sometimes he would stand. I'm not going to say flee with Jesus, but Jesus sometimes withdrew. Most of the times he stood. Paul fled sometimes he stood. You got to know within yourself two things. No, I'd say three things. One, what is your present strength in the midst of that persecution? Maybe you really are at the end of yourself, and it's not doing anyone any good for you to stay there. Or maybe you're getting pulled over into that side of thinking or believing. What is your strength in that moment? Only you can say. So I would think about that. And two, what is the weight of the argument of either? What is the weight of the argument to flee? What is the weight of the argument to stand? And only you can decide that. Maybe the argument to stand is stronger. And maybe your strength to stay is stronger. Maybe God is calling you, but maybe he's not. So what is your present strength? What is the weight of the argument? And three, I would say, if you aren't self-aware enough to think through that, then find a friend in faith, a trusted friend in faith, or a trusted few in faith. I wish that all of us had a small group that we were so intimate with in tracking with following Jesus that we could go to our small group and say, hey, here's what I'm going through. What do y'all think? If you're not self-aware enough to know if you got the strength or if standing or fleeing, the argument of either, you can't really think through it, go to someone that you trust to think through it. Or finally, what do you do if you are not persecuted, which is probably the biggest of the arguments, I'd say. I would say simply, don't take what you have for granted. If you are not being persecuted, do not take it for granted, because the vast majority of Christians throughout time have not experienced the level of comfort we have as a church. In years past, if cops walked through that door, they were there to arrest this person and the leaders of the church. If a cop walks through that door, we all know they're here to protect us. That is a privilege. Don't take it for granted. And be careful that you don't get so comfortable with the church that it becomes a nuisance to you. That gathering for worship or the church disciplines in your life become a distraction to you and your worldly pursuits. And by doing this, you will be thankful. So don't take it for granted by being thankful. Be thankful for the blessing that you have, that you are not persecuted. Be thankful for it. So what do you do if you're not persecuted? Don't take it for granted by being thankful and not seeing following the Lord as a nuisance to your life. B is very simple. Remember those who are persecuted in your prayer time. How many times a day do you pray for those who are persecuted? How many times a week do you pray for those who are persecuted? I bet, if I had to bet, if we were all honest, I'd say 80% of us would say 0. Add that to your prayer time. Prayer time, your church's prayer time, research it. You don't know about persecution in our world? You research a great many things? Look it up. It's still happening to this day. You get on the dark web and you can see our brothers and sisters being beheaded. You can see it. People like watching that. Remember those who are persecuted in this way. This is a low blow, and I admit it, okay? The next time you've had a long week, you know, the kids have been in sports all week, or you've been vacationing all week, or you're just really wanting to sleep off a long Saturday night, if you know what I mean, and church is feeling like a nuisance the next day. I know this is a low blow. Remember those who are persecuted. They got it a little worse than you do. So don't take it for granted. Remember those who are persecuted. Make sure you're doing the right thing. Maybe you're not being persecuted because God has called you to live out something right, and you're not living it out right, and that's why you're not being persecuted. Okay, I'll just close with this. If you're not being persecuted, you probably have a little extra spiritual energy. Stretch yourself. It's one thing. Persecution is a cost that is imposed from the outside. Obedience to the Lord is a cost that you impose from the inside. Okay, so maybe you're not called to give up your freedom, then use your freedom to glorify the Lord. Maybe you're not called to give up your livelihood, then use your livelihood generously to glorify the Lord. Maybe you're not called to be exhausted by beatings, then lean into your own exhaustion by following the Lord. Push yourself a little more to remember those who have been persecuted. So ask yourself one of these questions sometime today. Number 1. How often do you pray for the persecuted church? I think it's an important question. Just answer it and be honest with yourself. Even if you hear yourself, how often do you pray for the persecuted church every week? How often do you do it? Be honest with yourself. Hear yourself say 0, and it will be edifying. How often do you pray for the persecuted church? Or 2, what persecution or opposition have you experienced in your life? Physical persecution? Likely not. Verbal persecution? You've stood up for something? What persecution have you experienced? Or 3, which resulting blessing of persecution are you most drawn to? A purified church? A growing church? Your light shining? Your own personal fellowship with Jesus intensifying? Those are blessings that Jesus is alluding to. Which of those are you most drawn to?